Burt Lancaster kept a list. Not a list of enemies, not a list of grudges, but something he called the most evil of them all. 14 names written in private, names that belonged to the most celebrated faces in the history of American cinema. He carried that list for years without publishing it, without leaking it, without turning it into a weapon. And that silence, more than anything else, is what makes it so hard to shake. Because Lancaster wasn't a tabloid creature. He was a man who marched beside Martin Luther King Jr., who built his own independent film studio when the studios tried to own him, who stood up during the McCarthy era when standing up could end your career. When a man like that writes a private manuscript accusing 14 of Hollywood's most beloved legends of cruelty, manipulation, and abuse, it deserves more than gossip. It deserves a serious look. Lancaster was born on November 2, 1913, in Manhattan, raised in East Harlem by a working-class Irish-American family that valued discipline above almost everything else. Long before he ever read a film script, he was performing in the circus, working alongside his lifelong friend, Nick Cravat, in a traveling acrobatic act that taught him how to carry himself under pressure, how to move with control, and how to read the people around him with precision. That skill, developed high above the ground where a single miscalculation meant a fall, turned out to be exactly the kind of skill Hollywood rewarded and punished in equal measure. After serving in the U.S. Army's Special Services Unit during World War II, entertaining troops across Europe, Lancaster returned home and walked into an audition that changed everything. The 1946 noir film The Killers made him a sensation almost overnight, and within a decade he had appeared in From Here to Eternity, Elmer Gantry, Birdman of Alcatraz, and Judgment at Nuremberg, a body of work that would have satisfied most actors entirely. Lancaster, though, was never satisfied with just acting. He co-founded Hecht Lancaster Productions, one of the first serious independent studios in the industry, determined to make films that reflected reality rather than manufactured comfort. By the 1970s, as the golden age faded and the studio system cracked open, Lancaster began writing down what he had witnessed across 3 decades inside that world. He wasn't trying to destroy reputations, at least not by his own account. He described it more as a confession, an attempt to name the damage before his time ran out. The manuscript he produced listed 14 names, and the people on that list were not fringe figures or forgotten starlets. They were icons, the kind of faces that still appear on posters and postage stamps, the kind of names that children learn in film school as examples of what American cinema could achieve at its highest. What Lancaster claimed he saw behind those names was something altogether different. Kirk Douglas was the first name, and Lancaster knew him well, having starred alongside him in Gunfight at the OK Corral and 7 Days in May. To the public, Douglas represented defiance and independence. The man who fought the blacklist by giving Dalton Trumbo a writing credit on Spartacus when doing so was professionally dangerous. Lancaster saw something colder beneath that image. He described Douglas as a man who thrived on domination, who would betray a co-star to secure a role without hesitation, who manipulated producers through charm and discarded anyone who stopped being useful. Their professional partnership, once celebrated by critics and studios alike, had long since turned into mutual wariness, and Lancaster's description of why reads less like professional jealousy and more like a wound that never properly healed. Mickey Rooney came next on the list, and Lancaster called him the mask of mischief, a phrase that captures something essential about the distance between Rooney's screen persona and the man Lancaster claimed to have observed on set. Rooney's 8 failed marriages weren't simply bad luck in Lancaster's estimation. They reflected a pattern, a need for control that expressed itself differently in public than it did behind the scenes. Lancaster recalled watching him bully background performers and humiliate young actresses on set, turning what should have been ordinary working days into exercises in fear. The boy next door image that made Rooney one of the most commercially successful actors of the 1930s and 1940s was, according to Lancaster, precisely that, an image carefully maintained for the audience and abandoned the moment the cameras stopped rolling. Natalie Wood appeared on the list under a description Lancaster found almost too painful to write, and his entry on her is complicated in a way the others aren't because she was already dead by the time the manuscript circulated among his closest associates. Wood drowned in 1981 under circumstances that have never been fully resolved, and Lancaster connected her death not to accident or misfortune, but to what he saw as the inevitable end of a life lived in performance. He claimed she used emotional fragility as a professional tool, that the vulnerability audiences found so compelling on screen was deployed strategically off-screen to get people fired, to get scripts rewritten, to redirect attention. He once told a close friend that the sea didn't take her, Hollywood did, a remark that lands differently depending on how seriously you take the rest of what he wrote. Elizabeth Taylor occupied the next entry, and Lancaster's description of her is probably his most famous. He called her a storm wrapped in silk, and the image fits the evidence he cited. The production of Cleopatra in 1962, which became one of the most famously chaotic shoots in film history, reportedly halted for hours at a time over disputes that crew members later described as tests of power rather than genuine creative disagreements. Taylor's marriages, her public scandals, her willingness to let conflict become spectacle were not, in Lancaster's reading, signs of a passionate and unbounded nature. They were weapons. She didn't just steal scenes, he wrote. She stole souls. Spencer Tracy was someone Lancaster had worked with directly, and the entry on Tracy is among the most detailed in the manuscript. Publicly, Tracy was worshipped for his restraint and his depth, the actor who seemed to do nothing and somehow conveyed everything. Privately, Lancaster described him as an unpredictable force made worse by alcoholism, a man whose rages left crew members genuinely frightened, and whose reputation as a tortured genius gave him cover for behavior that would have ended a lesser career. During the filming of Judgment at Nuremberg in 1961, Lancaster claimed Tracy destroyed a makeup artist's supplies in fury over a minor error, an incident that went unrecorded in official accounts and unreported by anyone who witnessed it, because by that point people had learned that reporting Tracy's behavior simply wasn't done. James Stewart was the entry that surprised Lancaster's own associates most, because Stewart represented something close to sacred in American film culture: the good man, the honest man, Mr. Smith and George Bailey, and all the decent ordinary heroes who carried the weight of the country's self-image through some of its hardest decades. Lancaster's portrait of him was surgical. He didn't accuse Stewart of violence or cruelty in the conventional sense. Instead, he described a man who maintained control through quiet surveillance, someone who kept mental notes on co-stars' mistakes and passed them to directors under the guise of professionalism, someone whose celebrated patriotism carried a shadow of judgment that kept certain kinds of people off his sets. The cruelty Lancaster identified wasn't loud. That, he suggested, was exactly what made it so effective. Marilyn Monroe appears in the manuscript under the phrase "the angel of addiction," and Lancaster's entry on her is the most conflicted he wrote, because he seems to have genuinely pitied her while also holding her responsible for real damage. The Monroe he described wasn't the helpless victim that popular mythology has constructed around her memory. She used her fragility deliberately, in his account, arriving hours late to set during Some Like It Hot and other productions, not because she couldn't manage herself, but because her absence forced everyone else to orbit around her, to need her, to accommodate her. Her death wasn't a mystery to Lancaster. He saw it as the predictable conclusion of a life organized entirely around dependence, both her own and the dependence she cultivated in others. Errol Flynn received some of Lancaster's harshest language, and the historical record offers enough supporting detail to make that language hard to dismiss. Flynn's legal troubles, his string of scandals, his association with parties that witnesses later described in terms that don't belong in a family publication, all of it confirmed for Lancaster a belief that Hollywood's machinery was capable of protecting genuinely dangerous men indefinitely, as long as those men remained profitable. Flynn moved through the world as though consequences applied to other people, Lancaster wrote, and for most of his career, that assessment was accurate. Bing Crosby occupied a different kind of space in the manuscript because the abuse Lancaster described wasn't directed at rivals or crew members or women in the industry. It was directed at Crosby's own children. Lancaster described the household Crosby maintained as one governed by fear, where discipline crossed into cruelty, and where the gentleness that made White Christmas the best-selling single in recorded history at the time of Lancaster's writing existed in a completely separate reality from the one his family inhabited. Decades after Lancaster wrote those words, Crosby's eldest son Gary confirmed them in a memoir that described years of physical and emotional punishment. Lancaster had written about Gary as well, calling him the inheritor of darkness, a man who absorbed his father's rage and spent his adult life losing a battle against addiction and violence that he had effectively lost before it began. Henry Fonda's entry reads almost clinically by comparison, because the cruelty Lancaster identified in him wasn't physical or even deliberate. It was emotional, the particular kind of damage inflicted by a man who treats personal distance as a virtue and emotional unavailability as a form of integrity. Fonda moved through family life the way he moved through courtroom dramas, composed, controlled, and essentially unreachable. His children Jane and Peter grew up trying to earn something from him that he apparently didn't know how to give. Jane Fonda confirmed as much in later interviews, describing a childhood in which her father's approval felt perpetually conditional and perpetually out of reach. Jane herself appeared on the list, which Lancaster acknowledged was complicated given his sympathy for what she had survived. He didn't accuse her of her father's coldness. He accused her of something adjacent to it, using her considerable public influence as a mechanism of control, turning every platform into a tribunal where she decided who stood on the right side of history and who didn't. She could be warm 1 hour and completely unreachable the next, he wrote, a rhythm that echoed her father's without replicating it exactly. Joan Crawford's entry contains the phrase that circulated most widely among people who had read the manuscript. She ruled with her eyebrows and her fists. Crawford ran her household on the same principles of absolute authority that governed her professional life, and the people inside that household, including her children, paid the price for any deviation from her standards. Christina Crawford's memoir, published in 1978, confirmed what Lancaster had already written, and Lancaster saw that confirmation not as vindication but as sorrow, proof that Hollywood's capacity to produce iconic performances and private monstrosities from the same person had been hiding in plain sight for decades. The final name on the list was the one that circulated the least, partly because it seemed so improbable, and partly because the person named had become genuinely beloved in a way that made criticism feel almost violent. Lucille Ball, the architect of I Love Lucy and the founder of Dieselou Productions, the woman who made post-war American television feel warm and accessible and alive, appeared at the end of Lancaster's manuscript under the phrase, "the Queen of Control." Behind the physical comedy and the red hair and the laugh that built a network, Ball ran her studio with a precision that crossed from professional discipline into something Lancaster found darker. He described her tracking employees' mistakes in a private notebook and dismissing anyone who repeated them. He described meetings surveilled in ways that made genuine loyalty impossible to distinguish from performed loyalty. He described a script ordered rewritten overnight and then thrown back at the writer the next morning as a demonstration of power rather than a creative decision. That laugh saved CBS, he wrote, and it crushed the souls of those beneath her. Lancaster suffered his first serious heart attacks in the early 1980s, underwent bypass surgery in 1983, and then endured a stroke in 1990 that stole his speech entirely. For a man whose voice had carried through decades of theater and film, that silence carried its own particular weight. He died on October 20th, 1994, at the age of 80, with his wife Susan Martin beside him, and the manuscript he called the most evil of them all remained unpublished. Whether it still exists somewhere in a private collection or has been lost entirely, no one who knows will say. What remains are the accounts of those who read it, the names they remembered, and the question Lancaster never quite answered directly, whether he wrote it to protect the people who came after him, or simply because the weight of knowing had finally become too heavy to carry alone. The golden age of Hollywood built something genuinely beautiful, and Lancaster knew that as well as anyone who lived inside it. He also knew what the foundations were made of, and he decided at the end that someone should say so.